Today I will attempt to present to you a summary of public policies relating to living heritage as they developed in the 19th century onwards in Greece, but focusing mainly on the last quarter of the 20th century and the first decades of the 21st century. It is a well-known fact and well explored in the relevant literature that antiquities were one of the pillars upon which modern Greek nation building resided. However, the focus that had always been on classical Greek antiquity from the 5th century BCE till the 1st century BCE, with later additions that included Eastern Roman Empire, mostly known as Byzantium. So, despite the fact that cultural heritage policies have been instrumental in the process of building Greek national identity since early 19th century, cultural practices of contemporary people were deemed worthy so far as they could fill the gaps in the great narrative of the Greek nation's indissoluble continuum through the centuries. One might say that the imposing presence of ancient ruins led to a very convoluted path towards the appreciation of contemporary cultural expressions, whether of pre-industrial industrial communities or the emergent cultural expressions in the new state. Stewardship of heritage in Greece until almost the second decade of the 21st century meant protection of antiquities, movable artifacts and immovable such as archaeological sites and monuments. The main instrument for this was the statutory ownership of antiquities by the state. This is enshrined in the Greek legal system almost from the early days of the independent Greek state formed some 200 years ago. The reason for this rather extreme measure is, of course, illegal excavations and systematic plundering of antiquities. And ex lege ownership of all antiquities is the first and crucial step towards combating illegal trafficking. It must be noted that this is now common in the regulatory provisions of most states that are sources of antiquities highly priced in the international markets. Nevertheless, this forms a legal system and at the same time predisposes public agency towards two directions. The first is a perception of heritage that is inextricably bound with monuments, movable or not, tangible relics of the past in general. And the second is that methods and measures of heritage curating gravitate around state ownership. Given that it is a very severe measure, there are degrees of protection and grading, and these are based on historic events rather than on cultural change, and you can see them on the slide. What is relevant for this discussion is the fact that for their last grade, the so-called modern cultural heritage, the provisions can rarely be applied on state-owned goods. Otherwise, we would have an unacceptable curtailing of the right to private property. But the law or other appropriate legislation does not fully provide other means that would create a suitable framework for these cultural goods and expressions, I might add. Because the other important consequence of this system is the fact that cultural heritage is represented only as material goods, testimonies of long past eras. There is no reference to cultural practices, to procedures, but we will come to that later on. Until the last quarter of the 20th century, there has been no discernible public policy dealing with living heritage other than founding historical or ethnological museums. The first of those, the National Historical Museum, was founded in 1884 by the Historical and Ethnological Society of Greece, a private society, although since the first decades of the 20th century, the museum is funded by the state. The museum narrates the history of modern Greece, starting with the period of Latin and Ottoman rule in the Middle Ages, the Greek War of Independence that broke in 1821, the creation of the independent state, and the political, social, and cultural development of the Greeks up to the present date. Folk culture is not accentuated in the museum, but it is present and it's becoming more prominent in several projects of the museum, such as this landmark exhibition, Imagining the Balkans, that you can see on the left part of the slide. The other state museum is the Museum of Greek Folk Art, which was founded in 1918 by a group of Athenian intellectuals. The museum has changed its name several times, and now, during its transfer to its new buildings, which will be completed in next year, it is renamed once more as Museum of Modern Greek Culture, in accordance to the chronological terms used by the law that you saw before. The museum houses one of the most comprehensive collections of artifacts relating to almost all material cultural expressions since the 18th century, which is the actual beginning of modernity in what is now the Greek state. Both museums have been the model upon which many other historical and ethnological museums were founded in Greece during the post-war era. Founding of new museums was accentuated after the fall of the military dictatorship in 1974, and in the euphoric period that followed, a period of unfettered democracy after long years of authoritarian regimes, we witnessed a virtual boom in all sorts of activities that relate to folk culture and living heritage. A constellation of cultural associations were either formed or felt free to act according to their own perception of heritage. Many of them founded large or small historical and folk museums, but their main area of activity was and still is the transmission of what we now call intangible cultural heritage, meaning dance, music, handicrafts, and crafts in general. However, for reasons that we cannot fully elaborate on this short presentation, one cannot identify a coherent public policy regarding living heritage, not only in the first heady years of the restored Greek democracy, but even a lot later. The only means that Greek public administration had at its disposal was a limited budget for grants towards these cultural associations. The grant system was not always transparent because there were never fully articulated criteria for it. In my view, the problem was not so much transparency as such, but mainly the lack of a well-framed system of criteria for the grants and, of course, a system for evaluation afterwards. Nevertheless, things changed in the 1980s when an extensive and long-term program spanning more than 3 decades, a program for decentralization, was inaugurated. The main axis of it was the empowerment of local self-administration. Much of what is subject matter for a public policy on living heritage was now delegated to municipalities. The municipalities, left to their own devices without any institutional support on how to deal with that, resorted to simply funding again the same cultural associations, but now the associations were more encouraged to organize festivals such as that you can see on the upper left side of the right side of the slide, since they were those festivals good publicity opportunities for mayors or aspiring mayors. Few cultural institutions that were formed during the 1980s or 1990s survived till the present. The most successful of them is the institution of municipal and regional theatres, and this is a burgeoning network of local theatrical organizations conceived and first applied in 1984 by one of the most charismatic ministers of culture, Melina Mercouri. Public cultural policies after the second half of the 1990s were dominated by a massive EU co-funded program of building or restoring and rehabilitating much needed infrastructure. Museums, opera and ballet houses, symphony and modern dance halls, and several buildings for the performative arts in general were built during that time. Those landmark projects, however, were not very friendly to folk and popular culture. They were more oriented towards housing big national and international events. Some of them are still in search of their true function, such as one of the last, the restored Acropole Hotel that you can see on the bottom right part of the slide. This is an excellent Art Deco building opposite the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Restoration works finished 3 years ago, but only this month the Parliament will discuss a law that will stipulate the cultural functions to be housed here. Hoping that this short presentation of the trajectories followed by cultural policies in the 20th century may be illuminative to our main topic, which is policies dealing with living culture. Let's return here and begin again by the normative. In the slide, you can see the provisions of the Greek law for the protection of antiquities and cultural heritage for what is living heritage. And on the other part of the slide, you can see the provisions of the Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. Both texts mention intangible cultural goods one, heritage the other, and this is the first big difference among them. The Greek law refers to cultural goods that serve as testimonies of a lost past. The Convention, on the other hand, refers to cultural expressions of the living people, and what is more important, in the last sentence, it opens a window to the future, referring to human creativity. The second big difference is that the Greek law provides for the protection of these testimonies in any possible means, text, audio, or audiovisual, but only the protection of those that hold particular significance, as you can see. The Convention, on the other hand, is very wary of anything alluding to hierarchy in cultural expressions, and most of all, it bans any notion of their authenticity. Whether this is a futile exercise, this ban of authenticity, performed in filling the inventories of intangible cultural heritage in several countries, or it may foster our full appreciation of current cultural practices, this is an open question for the future. The third major difference is that the Convention refers to communities of the bearers, and however problematic this term may be, what is the definition of a community of bearers, what is its constitution, what is the role that they play. The communities of the bearers are the custodians of their own heritage. On the other hand, the Greek law implicitly recognizes as custodians the administration and the researchers, the academia. And these and only these can only deem some expressions as of particular importance so that it may be protected by listing and recording. The Convention reflects some major shifts to our understanding of heritage, and it is the product of long deliberations re-examining the dominant ideas on the role and meaning of heritage in contemporary societies. The first and most important shift is clear by the comparison with the Greek law. Heritage is not a material object, it is the relationship of living people with their past and the objects that come from that past. So, administration and academia have moved to the background, and the living people are given center stage here. Of course, as always, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, but even as a declaration of principles, this is refreshing. The second major shift, and here I think we can really speak of a paradigm shift, is this model of stewardship inaugurated by the concept of safeguarding. This is a concept that rests upon community participation on the one hand and on intersectoral approaches on the other. So here you can see the main differences between the two management models of monuments on the one hand and heritage on the other. Protection for monuments first and foremost means keeping people away from the monuments because their presence might be harmful. Safeguarding, on the other hand, means empowering the bearers of heritage, empowering the people so that they can transmit their heritage. Protection is based mainly on technical expertise on restoration, conservation. Safeguarding, on the other hand, is a holistic approach where identity issues are tackled, are given serious consideration, and orality is predominant. And what is important, and we will refer to it a bit later on, is that in the protection model, we have limited intersectoral connections, whereas with the safeguarding model, we are almost obliged to form intersectoral policies. Implementing the convention in Greece was not an easy task, I can assure you. In our department, we all come from a scholarly background that did not introduce us to the role of public folklorist or public anthropologist or public historian. Far from that, taking into account our age and the fact that due to the decade of austerity measures in Greece, we could not hire recent graduates that would be to some extent familiarized with that role. The most important exercise that helped us form our initial perception of community participation was inventorying in 2014 and thus selecting for the representative list of ICH of Humanity an element, a custom of Pontian origin Greeks, Momoeria, which is a New Year's celebration among them. Drafting the inventory entry and 1 year later the nomination file presented us with challenges such as the scope of the community, the representation of the community, the discourse of the community, how it can be transmitted in written text in a nomination form, etc. It is an ongoing subject of deliberation among my colleagues and among the wider public, academic or not. I doubt that we may reach any conclusive answers soon, but what matters most is experimenting with that and keeping an open mind on this issue. The other challenge that the convention presents is that of intersectoral approach to heritage, particularly when it comes to craftsmanship. We are used to measures that emanate from the Ministry of Culture and are carried out by the same ministry. Here we have to take into account several other agents, other branches of public administration, such as branches that deal with tax regulation, social security regulations, as well as the private sector and the civil society. It must also be mentioned that the implementation of the ICH Convention in Greece coincided with the outbreak of the financial crisis in the second decade of the 21st century, and this led to very interesting developments. A paradigm shift was in a sense facilitated by these extraordinary conditions, while on the same time it was severely inhibited by the repercussions of the fiscal crisis, meaning lack of funding, but more importantly, aging staff with no new recruits. So far, I have tried to convey a long and convoluted process in dealing with living heritage from the perspective of the administration. It has always been a matter of balancing between the monumental and the ephemeral, a difficult balance to strike. But in some rare cases, such as the latest addition to the National Inventory, the Mesosporitsa festivity, this balance seems easy. enjoy a few pictures of this festivity that honors Virgin Mary in a time of the year that farmers sow the seeds for the new harvest. There, in November, in mid November, people go in procession through the site of Eleusis to receive the blessing for the sacred crop of Demeter, for the wheat harvest they have just sown. And this is rather marvelous to watch two religions and two cultures so many millennia apart from each other using the same site to perform almost the same thing, a propitiation for a good harvest. Thank you.